Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Not only did they give money in the 20s to the Nazis, but they continued to give money through Union Bank in the 1930s. And in fact, an associate of mine, a historian named Anton Chaitkin, who's been studying the Harrimans for years, just discovered that in 1942, after the United States was already at war with Nazi Germany, Union Bank was still giving money to the Nazis. And it was cited by the U.S. Justice Department under the Trading with the Enemy Act. That is, George Bush's father, Prescott Bush, was a member of the board of a bank which included on its board two top German industrialists who were building weapons that were being used against Americans in Europe. And Prescott Bush, did he protest the Nazis? Did he resign from the bank? No, he continued to make money and shape policy on this bank. Union Bank, by the way, was a subsidiary of something called the Thyssen Bank, which was owned by the German industrialist Thyssen. And so Prescott Bush, served on the board of a bank with a man who, after the war ended, wrote a book, his autobiography, called I Financed Hitler. An interesting background, is it not? Supporting the communist dictators, supporting the Nazis. Now, it shouldn't be surprising because there's one other thing the Harrimans did. They didn't simply believe that they were superior because they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They acted on it. They financed something that was involved in trying to stop immigration to this country. The Anti-Immigration League was financed by Averell Harriman's mother. They gave an award in 1932 to a man named Ernst Rudin, who by 1934 was writing the racial laws of Germany, which condemned Jews and many, many others, basically people who opposed the Nazis, were condemned to death by this man who in 1932 was given an award by the Harrimans. That is, that they simply didn't have this belief, they acted on it. They truly believed that non-whites, and even some whites, they didn't like a lot of the white people around either. I mean, they were real elitists. They didn't just differentiate between blacks and Asians and others. They even kept out Italians. They wanted to keep out Russians, Russian Jews, and others. So this is the background to the President of the United States. You haven't seen this, I trust, on NBC News, have you? Have you seen any of this on CBS? Did Ted Koppel bring it out on Nightline? Has it been in the Houston Post or the Washington Post? If it hasn't been, then they're involved in a cover-up, which is not surprising. Now, Bush's personal background. He's a very strange character. He came back from World War II. He went to Yale University. He joined Skull and Bones. And then he set off for Texas. And his biographies all talk about what a great guy. He could have stayed on Wall Street, but instead he set off on his own to make a fortune in Texas. Well, it's not hard to make a fortune in Texas if you start with a fortune. He was backed by his father's friends. Dresser Industries, in fact, bankrolled him when he first came to Texas. There's another side of Bush that's worth looking at in terms of his present problems, his present health problems. That is, he's an obsessive personality. He's the kind of guy who has an obsession with his physical fitness. I'm sure you've noticed this. This they have covered. You've seen Bush racing around, supposedly on vacation, and he does more work on vacation trying to relax than anyone. For example, the other day, before going to the summit in London, Bush was running around the golf course. He played 18 holes of golf in an hour and 20 minutes, which means he was running all the way. And they said, Mr. President, shouldn't you be relaxing? After all, you just recently had this heart problem, this thyroid problem, and so on. And his answer was, I want to get this over early. Get the boat over early. Get the tennis over early. Because we got a lot of work to do. So he wants to get his relaxation over early. That's a bit obsessive. Well, Bush came down to Texas with that kind of obsessive personality and that kind of background. And what did he do? He rattled around the oil fields for a while. He made a lot of money. There are a number of things we don't know yet about the early career of Bush, and there are things that need to be investigated. For example, his possible involvement in arming the anti-Castro movement in the early 1960s. That Bush may very well have been functioning with the CIA long before he was named the director of the CIA in the 1970s. We're looking into that. We're investigating it. By the time we're through, there won't be anything hidden about this man. Even if you don't read it in the Houston Chronicle or see it on television, you'll be able to see it on our television shows, and you'll be able to read about it in New Federalist and the Executive Intelligence Review. But in 1964, just take an example. Bush ran for Senate that year. One of his major campaign issues was that he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. This is one of the landmark bills. Its passage was absolutely essential to transform or to realize the dream that had been fought for by the civil rights activists in the 1930s, the 40s, and the 50s, to guarantee a right to vote and certain other extremely important measures. Well, Bush opposed it in his campaigning. It's not surprising that today we see him throw a temper tantrum anytime anybody asks him about the present civil rights legislation, which he's threatening to veto anytime it comes to his desk. This was in his campaign against the U.S. Senator at that time, Ralph Yarborough. Now, when he got to the Congress, he was elected a congressman from Houston, from the so-called Silk Stocking District. Bush's main interest was population control, population reduction. His father was an active supporter of Planned Parenthood, which was founded by a woman initially, Margaret Sanger, whose argument was that there are too many inferior people. And in her earlier writings, she had the Harriman line, that colored people are inferior, and we should introduce birth control to them so they'll stop producing so many. This is the viewpoint that started Planned Parenthood. And this was the viewpoint of Bush's father. And when Bush's father lost his Senate race, I believe in 1960 or 62, he attributed it to his connection to Planned Parenthood, which was considered by many at that time to be a subversive organization. It definitely was. Today, of course, it's considered a chic, politically correct thing to do, to be supposedly for birth control. But Bush wasn't just for birth control. He was for population reduction. In fact, we were recently told by some congressional staffers that when Bush was in the Congress, he was known as Rubber's Bush. I'll leave that to your own imagination to understand why. Now, was this just a harmless obsession? Well, take a look at what Bush did in 1969. In 1969, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there was a movement in this country to turn back civil rights. Now, they didn't put someone on television like Bush to say, we're opposed to civil rights. They'd gotten more sophisticated. They got a Nobel Prize winner named Shockley. And they got another professor named Jensen, supposedly intelligent men, to conduct studies to try to prove that blacks are genetically inferior to whites. And they conducted a whole series of tests and experiments to prove this. Now, needless to say, they didn't take into consideration any aspect which might have shown why the testing didn't show equality of education or equality of intelligence. They just took different sets of people, and they were even doing things that the Nazis had done in terms of measuring intelligence. And so they went around the country in the late 60s trying to promote this idea. Now, they weren't simply saying that blacks are inherently inferior. What they were saying is it's a mistake to spend money on programs such as Head Start or various welfare programs because it's not only a waste of money, but it will produce more and more and more inferior people. Who did they go to in the Congress? They went to Rubber's Bush, who conducted a hearing. Now, these guys had been denounced by the scientific community, but Bush gave them a platform in the Congress, and afterwards Bush read their studies into the congressional record and said he agrees that they should be taken seriously, their work should be taken seriously, because he himself fears, and this is the word he used, a downbreeding of the population. That is, his argument was that since minorities were reproducing at a faster rate than white people, that this would downbreed the population. And what's the implication? Therefore, we shouldn't have aid to dependent children. We shouldn't have welfare, food stamps, Head Start programs, because it only encourages them to produce more. This was the argument presented in the Congress in 1969 by George Bush. And it's in the congressional record. Anybody could read it. Even Ted Koppel could read this. Have you seen Koppel talk about this? Doesn't this seem scandalous to you? That the President of the United States was supporting the reduction of the black population in that period of time? Certainly seems that way to me. Beyond that, Bush later was a leading figure in the administration, the Nixon administration, in promoting something called National Security Study Memo 200, which argued that not just in the United States, but worldwide, there are too many people. And this needs to be addressed. And this memo identified 13 nations which it said were reproducing too quickly. What did all these nations have in common? Either they were predominantly Muslim nations or predominantly black nations, a number of African nations like Nigeria, or Asian nations. Now, what they argued was not just that this population growth was a problem, but that it threatened future U.S. security. Why? Because as these populations grow, they will demand that more of their resources be used to take care of their growing populations at home. Well, that makes sense. If a nation is growing and developing, it needs more food, it needs more technology, more industry to ensure a growing standard of living. After all, isn't that how the United States developed? But the argument in this national security memo is that it's against U.S. national security for these nations to grow. And in fact, the United States should use credit policy and should use all means at its disposal to stop the population growth. During this period of time that this memo came out and was circulated as government policy, Bush was initially the U.S. Special Representative in China. And China, by the way, under its present communist dictatorship, is known as a nation which practices infanticide to keep down its population. That is, there are many cities in rural China where parents kill their firstborn, if it's a daughter, to reduce population under government policy. And that started about the time that Bush was the official U.S. representative in China. And secondly, Bush then became CIA director, and this memo was given to him to implement. That's a little bit of George Bush's background. Now, what else did he do before he became our beloved vice president and then president? Well, he was a CIA director for a while. You don't just walk in off the street and become CIA director. You have to have some either family or institutional connection. Because the CIA is sort of like the mafia. You know the word Cosa Nostra, which means our thing. Well, they learned everything they know from the CIA, which, by the way, very often works with organized crime. In fact, there are times you can't tell the CIA apart from organized crime. And this was a position that Bush held for a period of time. Now, later on, we all know about something I'll talk about in a few minutes, the so-called October surprise. That is, the argument that the Reagan-Bush campaign was afraid that Jimmy Carter was going to cut a deal with Khomeini to have the hostages released. Therefore, the Reagan-Bush campaign negotiated a deal with Khomeini's forces that the hostages be held till after the election to ensure Carter's defeat and the Reagan-Bush victory. Now, Bush claims he wasn't there. He claims that a lot. You ever notice that? I don't think Bush has ever been at any serious meeting if you listen to his explanations. And yet, he was the person who was assigned by the campaign committee to oversee the October surprise, to make sure there was not an October surprise.